So this is a very exciting moment for us. With the Conference Board of Canada, we've been doing a tremendous amount of research around how do we go about understanding community well-being and measuring the idea of community well-being. Ultimately, it's about affecting our professions, architecture, urban planning, engineering, interiors, landscape, and try and inform decisions and inform the conversations with communities. And this report provides a bit of a methodology and also a set of indicators and metrics. But we do see that as much as this is a culmination of a tremendous amount of research, it's also a starting point. It's a moment when we're launching a bigger conversation with communities, with a lot of our clients, with a lot of the people that we work with, to test these ideas and see how they work out in the field and do some pilot projects. So we see that there will be a version 2 and a version 3 and a version 4 as the years unfold. So it is a very exciting moment, but it's also an exciting in as much as it is about extending that conversation much broader. Listen in. How's everyone doing? Are you all properly caffeinated? Good. You got some fruit? Got going? Awesome. So I want to start just by telling you a little bit of a story. About 5 years ago or thereabouts, we went through a soul-searching exercise and literally asked ourselves, why do we get up in the morning? And I'm sure each one of you individually and within your own organizations have done a little bit of the same. It's like, why am I doing this? Why do I get up every morning and why does it matter? And the exercise really led us into trying to understand what's the purpose of our projects, what's the purpose of our disciplines, what's the purpose of the different sectors that we're working within. And we came up with a statement. And it sounds straightforward, took us a while to get there, but it really speaks to the notion of, hey, there's a craft that we love design, we love planning, we love city building, right? We love these things, and there's a sense of purpose in it all, right? It's really about meaningfully improving the well-being of communities. And truth be said, if it's not about that, like, why do it, right? Why get up in the morning? So, woohoo, great, we had a statement. What the hell does that mean, right? We all of a sudden discovered we really had no idea what community well-being meant. How did we know we were doing it? How did we know we were in fact meaningfully improving well-being, right? And in many regards, it's not unlike where the conversation around sustainability was maybe 20, 30 years ago. Sounds great, we want to be sustainable. What the hell are we talking about? Nobody knew at that point how to measure it, how to go about understanding if we were doing it or not. Today, we can measure the carbon footprint of everything, right? That cup of coffee, like, we know the carbon footprint of that. Well-being is a notion that, in many regards, the maturity around that conversation is more or less at that stage. There's a lot of intuitive notions of where it makes sense, and there's a lot of people starting to think about it, but truly, as an industry, we don't know what we're talking about. So hence we decided that we would team up with the Conference Board of Canada. And why? Because they do things that we don't do. They're experts around research. They're experts around developing robust research methodologies. They come at it from a perspective of indicators and economists and the types of things that really complement what we do. And we developed a methodology, like how do we go about doing this kind of a research? And we started about 2 years ago. And it started with doing a literature review of over 3,000 pieces of literature. And at that point, we discovered, well, actually, there's a lot of thinking that is emerging on a number of different fields, right? So United Nations has indicators around community well-being, which are great. But they tackle things that may not affect as much the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day project. So, for example, access to water or access to sewage. Great, really important things, but again, not as relevant. Or City of Vancouver has indicators around community well-being. Again, great, but they're tracking things like voter turnout rates or high school dropout rates. Really important, but not something that as architects, as urban planners, as landscape architects, interior designers, and engineers, that really affects the decisions of our projects. So then we started to just talk to anybody who would talk to us, right? We started to engage chief medical officers and a lot of our clients and municipal staff and city mayors and just everybody who could inform this conversation. And as you can imagine, this all of a sudden started to yield a tremendous amount of thinking. But then we started to kind of navigate between that and try to understand how we could go about bringing some wherewithal into that thinking. The first part was actually coming up with a definition. Like, how do we define community well-being? And it took us at least 6 months just to get to that definition. We knew that we wanted it to be something that would affect all of our professions, right? Everybody in the room, the types of things that we're working on, from the building interiors to the building itself, to the site, to the neighborhood, to generally kind of the region and the ecosystems within which we work, right? We knew that it had to be kind of a variety of different scales. Otherwise, it wouldn't be relevant to a lot of what we do. It also had to be relevant to kind of the city building, the architecture, the urban planning, the interiors, it had to be relevant to some of these pieces. So how do we go about defining it? Well, we actually adopted a well-understood definition that is used in Australia, and other places use it in order to understand the built environment. And that is that it's a combination of a number of different things, so social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political domains. And this is really important. And we debated for a couple of months, just should the word political be in there? And we decided that absolutely it must. And the reason for that is that actually speaks to process. That speaks to the voices of who participated in the process matter, right? How we came about, who was part of the conversation actually matters to the conversation. And this was a tremendous watershed moment for us in the conversation, because it meant that no longer could this be a top-down, externally imposed system that you would kind of force into a project. All of a sudden, it had to be a system that had to be tailored and nuanced and really emerge on a project-by-project, community-by-community, context-by-context basis. This was so important that it actually became reinforced in the second part of the definition, right? That individuals and communities need to be part of that conversation, right? So all of a sudden, our definition launched us in a very different course. It launched us into really starting to understand what are some of the important conversations that we have to have within the context of a project. But it meant we weren't going to be a measuring system. We weren't going to be a set of standards. We were in fact going to be a mechanism in which we were going to guide decision-making through projects, right? Which is a very different way of understanding it. But we felt that it was really important in terms of actually meaningfully improving the well-being of communities. We weren't trying to benchmark once against another. We were trying to inform decisions. So we start with this kind of intuition, community well-being, and we start to get a little bit of better sense of that definition. We started to then layer the domains that came from the definition, and then we started to deliver some of the indicators, and then eventually some of the metrics that start to inform each one of these. And there's a couple of wheels on the table around some of these. But if you walk around our office, you start to see people at their desks have these wheels pinned up, and they're starting to really use them in the context of projects. But I'll walk you through the different indicators. As part of testing the indicators, we actually did case studies. So we went to projects that we understood well, that we had all the documentation, and that we could talk to all the people, communities, clients, neighbors, users of that project from its inception all the way to its occupancy, to really see if these indicators and metrics were making sense. The first case study was the Durham Regional Police, which is a project that is actually fairly complex, but also fairly typical of issues that a project that of a mid-size would start to deal with. And very intentionally, we picked different case studies that reflected very different elements. So I'll use the Durham Regional Police as the backdrop to talk about that first domain, which is the social domain. Within the social domain, the first indicator was welcoming. Clearly, if a project is not designed to be welcoming to everybody, regardless of background, regardless of physical abilities, regardless of income, right? It wasn't going to be contributing to the broader well-being of the community. So it was really important to make welcoming a significant part of the conversation on any project from day one. And all of these are intended to inform day one, right? If a project never asked the question, how are we going to make this welcoming? Clearly, we were not going to be able to deliver community well-being. Second one, what are the support systems that any given community, be it the community within a building, the community within a neighborhood, whatever the community is, what are the support systems that they need for their day-to-day life? That's a really important question to ask right at the beginning of the project, and often it's not asked until later or not realized until the building is occupied. Oh, we realized we actually needed X, Y, or Z, right? A daycare or access to food or access to different elements. So by doing this, we're actually forcing these things to come right at the beginning of the conversation. The third one is socialization. And it's incredible the amount of literature that points us at the importance of socialization for mental health, for social well-being, for a number of different fronts. We know that we can push 10 years further in quality of life and the early onset of dementia and Alzheimer's if we have great spaces for socialization. So our projects need to be addressing that. Open space, interior space, all those environments where people are checking in and at each other and kind of and touching base. The second case study that we looked at was the banks. The banks is a residential project. It's a very different type of a project, obviously, than a civic building, which was the Durham Regional Police. And I'll use it as a backdrop to talk about the environment. The first indicator that we really wanted to talk around in the environment was delight and enjoyment. Clearly, if a place is not geared for the enjoyment of people, if it's not geared to be a place where people can linger, where people want to stay, where people want to be part of it, if people are only coming and leaving and they're not, and it's a very functional space, that environment was not going to be able to support the broader well-being. And this is key. This is starting to be tracked in hospitals and healthcare buildings on a number of different fronts, right? So one of the metrics in that indicator is, for example, biophilia, right? The access to and views to nature and the access and views to natural environments and the literature that tracks the impact that that has on the well-being of individuals and families and communities is incredible. The second indicator is very much the types of things that you would often see tracked in reviewing the environment, right? So the health of the natural systems and natural capital, so water, energy, air, all of these kinds of things. We're really tracking carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Clearly doing the types of things that is going to support the environment is going to support the well-being of people. And environment and people are intricately linked, and we always want to understand those things together. Mobility, it's an indicator. It could have landed almost in any one of those domains. But how do we both support active lifestyles and reduce car dependency become critical elements in enhancing community well-being? We know there was an article just recently around how cycling actually extends your life. Absolutely, we know these kinds of things. And in fact, this is one of those areas where the literature is the most advanced by linking active lifestyles with health, right? The areas where we're really only scratching the surface as a society is around mental health, around social segregation, around many other aspects of social well-being and mental well-being. The fourth one is resilience, right? Do we really understand what are some of the hazards that any community will face? And do we actually have an ability to understand how we're going to manage that and how are we going to adapt and how are we going to be better at the outcome of it instead of worsened by it? So really starting to focus on creating resilience plans and understanding all of your objectives around resiliency. Our third case study, Decidedly Jazz, a building in Calgary. So this is extensively an office building, but it accommodates dance studios and community uses and all kinds of things. So again, a very different type of a context and a very different type of a project. But I'll use it as the backdrop for the economic domain. So the first one is affordability. And a lot of us immediately think about affordable housing, but we really want to look at the affordability of all aspects of lifestyles, right? So affordable mobility, affordable access to recreation, affordable access to food, There's all kinds of things that really need to speak to how people are being able to access the things that they need on a day-to-day basis. And that's critical. If we don't have that, if we haven't addressed that, if our project hasn't asked this question, we're not going to be able to really enhance the well-being of that community. Second one is complete communities, right? And this is this notion that the ability to undertake the activities of your everyday life within walking distance. If we're thinking about the economy, if we're thinking about the lifestyles of folks within that walking radius distance, then we're really talking about that community. We're talking about that environment. It allows us to focus things in a very special way. The third one is really kind of that life cycle value generation that gets, it's a way of thinking, right? It's about future-proofing, it's about thinking about projects as they move through their whole life cycle. It's not just about the capital, it's also the operating, the management, and all of those pieces, which is where often a conversation around the economic domain would tend to go. And then the fourth one is about the local economy. Because we know that if we can spin a dollar, if we can source materials locally, if we can create opportunities for entrepreneurialism, if we can create opportunities for folks within the community to really develop a local economy, then the well-being of that community is going to be further enhanced. So again, we're pointing at projects. Let's start to think about this. Let's start to think about how can we engage the broader community and how can that support the local economy. The fourth domain is the cultural domain, and this is the Edmonton LRT. We also wanted to make sure that this started to make sense for large infrastructure projects or other city building type of interventions. And how did we start to think about it? So the first domain, first indicator in this domain is around cultural vitality, right? Are we providing access? Are we really providing environments where you're going to have opportunities for cultural and recreational vitality? And in fact, are we asking the questions with our communities? And one of the communities that we've been doing a lot of engagement with is Indigenous communities. Is, how do we create environments that really recognize the cultural lens and the cultural needs of an Indigenous community or different types of communities? Second one is a sense of belonging. And I had a kind of an aha moment. We were doing the University of Saskatchewan's campus master plan. And in that, we were meeting with an Indigenous student, and he was born there. And standing in the middle of the campus, he told me, I don't feel like I belong. His entire life, he's been there. And he said, I don't feel like I belong, right? I feel this environment is alien. That was tragic to me. It spoke to the inability of that environment to even recognize and acknowledge that there was a disconnect. So I think it's incredibly important for us to be thinking about what is going to be an environment, and let's have those conversations with our communities, with our stakeholders. How are we going, in fact, to enhance a sense of belonging for anybody who's going to be part of this environment? The third one is play. And it's incredible, again, the amount of literature that links play to well-being. And it's not just kids, it's all of us, right? The ability to engage the world creatively. The ability to relax and engage each other creatively, right? And are projects, in fact, creating environments for that? Or are they precluding us from being able to participate in the environments creatively? And learning. Learning is also incredibly linked to the notion of well-being. And it's not just the lifelong learning, which in itself is a tremendous goal and a very important contributor. It's also the ability for people to understand, why the hell are we doing all of this? Right? If we're wagging the finger and telling people they should live active lifestyles, and people don't get it, they don't buy into it, they don't know why this is important, then the uptake is going to be very low. So learning has to be a big part of it. The last one is the political domain. And I love this photograph. We were doing the wayfinding strategy for the City of Toronto, and we were setting up in the Jack Layton ferry terminal, and Batman and the Joker took a little break from taking photographs with tourists and came down and engaged in our consultation process. The political domain is really about who's participating in the process and drawing attention on the importance of the voices that do participate. So the first indicator is is this an integrated process? Did we get everybody who needed to be part of it, right? And did we get people from different backgrounds being part of the conversation from day one, right? But just because they were there doesn't mean that it was a collaborative process. So did we have a collaborative process? Did we have the right mechanisms for collaboration? Did we, in fact, get all those folks participating? And ultimately, are we creating an environment where we're really fostering a sense of ownership and stewardship, right? And it's not just that the designer or the planner or the client, the owner kind of owns this environment. We want every user, every person to feel like they are part of stewarding the outcome of it. So if you can't control your space, if you can't plant your garden or own your front yard, if you can't feel like you can be a member of a resident association, if you can't feel like your opinions matter and that your voice matters, clearly we're not going to be able to deliver that sense of community well-being. So where does this lead us? So we had a sense that there was a number of indicators, there's a number of metrics, we tested them on a number of different projects, and they refined. Every time we went through a case study, they evolved and they refined. But then we thought, you know what, we really need to kind of start taking these out into communities and start to get a little bit of a sense of how they're being used out in the practice. So this is a project in Ottawa, here on Gate, where we started to tackle the conversation with the community and try to frame it in the context of community well-being. And in fact, it was really interesting because really complex questions like affordability, like displacement, like social segregation came into a very different light when we were started to kind of have some of these conversations. So this is the local councillor talking about the importance of community well-being. You see the panel in the backdrop. You actually see all of these materials being used in the context of that workshop. And it was very interesting to start to see that becoming a way of framing the conversation. And in fact, it allowed us to have some really important conversations. This is out in the township of Petrolia. Petrolia is a town, and they suddenly discovered that they could actually do a much greater job if they worked together. Because the hospital can only do a few things, the town could only do a few things, but if we brought a real lens around community well-being, it started to make some very different approaches. So we've started to use it on a number of different projects. We're really testing it out, but we're also doing, and I should mention that all of this research, all of this we're just putting it all out there. We're not keeping any intellectual property on it. We're sharing it with everybody in the world, and that's a big part of today. But we're also going to the final report is going to be fully public, because we imagine that different folks will start to use it in different ways, right? And you yourselves will start to take some ideas and you'll say, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, this may inform my process. And we'll start to collect some of that feedback. We'll start to engage much broader in how those things start to come back to us. And it will be really important because even though we're working towards this deadline of getting the first report out, we already know that we're going to be working towards version 2 and version 3 and version 4 of it as we start to collect more and more information. So we did literature review and case studies, and we've in fact done a fair bit of peer review. So we had Laval University and CERES, the Center for Research Around Disabilities, and DIAC, the Design Industry Advisory Council, and Public Health Ottawa have all done peer reviews of our outcomes. And their insight has also helped make it stronger. We still imagine that there's going to be roundtables, that there's going to be pilot projects, that there's going to be all kinds of ways in which we're going to continue to further the thinking and evolve it and just share it as broadly as we can. And why? Because ultimately, if we really want to improve the well-being of communities, then the more people who can be doing this, the better. But thanks for coming.